Thank you for coming this evening. Glad to have everyone with us as we continue our study in the book of 1 Timothy. Please turn to chapter 5. We'll be beginning in verse 14 this evening. 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning in verse 14. We're going to continue the section that talks about various different groups of people in the congregation with the instructions that apply to those and what they ought to be taught, how the people ought to treat them, and so on. And in particular, in the section that we're discussing widows and care for widows. We tried to point out that there are different groups of widows that are described in this section. There are widows in general, and the family has the primary responsibility of taking care of them, but there are some widows who have no family, not only no husband, but no children, and no family to take care of them. Those are called widows indeed, and some of them, certain ones, are described as being enrolled, cared for by the congregation. But we're currently discussing a different group, and that's the younger widows and what they should do, in contrast to these that are older. And so we talked about the widow indeed, who's desolate and trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers, but does not live in pleasure. So we discussed that widow, and then more specifically, the enrolled widow, who was at least 60 years old, wife of one man, well reported of for good works, had brought up children, lodged strangers, and washed the saints' feet, relieved the afflicted, diligently followed every good work. So we have those instructions about those groups of widows, and now we're discussing the younger widows, those whose husband has died, but yet they're still of a marriageable age, and what he says that they should do. And that's where we were at the end of our class last time. We want to continue this evening, talk some about the younger widows, and then wrap it up with the discussion in verse 16, comparing what the individual responsibility is to what the church responsibility is. So, questions, discussion before we move into more discussion on the younger widows. Let's go ahead and read the verses. We read last time verses 11 through 13, talking about the problem of younger widows. If they're supported, they may become idle. They don't have a family, obviously, but they if they're supported, then they may become busybodies and get involved in things they should not. So let's read verse 14 through 16. Who'd like to read chapter 5, verse 14 through 16 for us, please? Bill, please.
Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry their children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside from Satan. And if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows.
Okay. So here he describes, he's talked about the fact that the danger of the church supporting these younger widows in verses 11 through 13. So what should the younger widows do? What is the preferred course for our younger widow according to verse 14? What does he say they should do? Bill.
They're to marry their children, manage the house, and give no opportunity to the adversary.
Okay, so the younger widows are supposed to marry, bear children, manage the household, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Okay, so what does this tell you? In contrast to the widow who was described before in the earlier verses, if she's supported, she can get involved in things she should not be. What is this telling us about what a younger widow should be involved in then? How would you summarize what he's saying here about their responsibility? Terry.
She's to fulfill what God intended for her to be doing with her life.
Which is?
Taking care of her children and managing her household, seeing to the needs of her house and keeping house, and being careful that the things that she says and does do not bring reproach.
Okay. So understand we're talking about a widow here, but while that's true of a widow, the same thing would be true of any young woman. this is God's plan for a young woman. A woman was created to be a companion to a man. In Genesis chapter 2, the man and the woman were told to cleave to one another, and the two become one flesh, and they're to bear children and to bring up the children. So the woman was created for primarily what I would call domestic responsibility, family responsibility. That's what she was created for. Now, please understand when we talk about this, that we realize that there are some cases where a woman simply, for whatever the reason, is not able to marry, and there can be a few reasons. But nevertheless, this is the ideal. This is what the design was from the beginning. And if a young woman has the opportunity to marry a widow or whatever, this is what she should do, because this is what she was created to do. And we'll see that the connection, if you think back now to the older widows, they are to be ones who've done this. They are considered to be widows indeed and to be enrolled and so on, because these are some of the things that they've done. It fits with what we've already learned about the older widows. Okay? Questions or discussion or comments? Frank?
In this she's the younger widow is commanded to remarry, and Paul in one of the letters to the Corinthians tells us that people who are widowed are freed from the law of the previous marriage and can remarry. And so if this young lady who remarries later in life, is her husband dies, her second husband dies, then is she not qualified to receive support from the church?
Okay, on the basis you mean that she has, verse 9, she has to be the husband or the wife of one man?
Yes.
And now she's been married to two. Okay. Comments on that? Debbie?
She was married to one at a time.
Okay. At any point in her life, she would be married to one man. Besides, if she does what she's told to do as a young widow, she marries again, and that disqualifies her to be a widow indeed who can be enrolled in the congregation. That's like punishing her for doing what she's told to do. So as far as I can see, when it says that she has been the wife of one man, that means at any given time in her life, she's the wife of one man. That's what Debbie would say. That's my conclusion. Other comments on that? I really can't see scripturally that you would penalize her for having done what God says she should do.
That was the conclusion that I had come to, but we hadn't discussed that point of it.
Right, we had.
Talked about verse 9.
Okay, thank you. All right. Anything else on verse 14? I think we understand what it means when it says the young widow should marry. And it's fairly obvious what it means about bearing children. How about managing the household? What does it mean when it says she's to manage the household? And you have different translations, of course, of it, depending on what translation you have. Terry?
When you look at Proverbs 31, that's a pretty clear explanation of what a woman does to manage her household.
Okay. All right, Proverbs 31. So what are some things that the worthy woman in Proverbs 31 does that would fit this idea of managing her household? What are some things she's involved in?
She sees to the needs of the family, what they're going to eat, what they're going to wear. Whoever is helping her with her work in Proverbs 31, she has people that help in her household. She sees to their needs and makes sure everybody has a job. And she does her job so well that she's praised by the people that she is managing, and her husband is praised in the gates because his household is run well.
Okay, so again, you have a woman who's very involved with the family. Her husband is blessed by having this godly wife, and her children and other people, apparently even servants in the household and so on in that case. So again, there's many aspects of managing a household. Okay, other comments on Daryl?
I think it also means that the overbearing husband who thinks he should dictate to his wife everything about how she cooks, how she cleans, how she takes care of all those things is overstepping his bounds a little bit. She's told to manage the household.
Okay, so we've been discussing wives and women in this context. We talked some about the man back in verse 8 as caring for his household, providing for his household. But the wife who marries is subject to her husband. Other passages, not discussed here, but other passages say that he's the head of the wife, Ephesians chapter 5, and she's to be in subjection to him. But while that's true, it's also true that any good head of any good group is used wisely, allows those subject to him to use their abilities to accomplish the needs of the group. And in particular, if a husband wants a wife to be a companion and to be a mother to his children, he has to allow her to make some decisions. And there's a good bit of involvement in that where the wife is making many decisions in many aspects, but always not that she has the right to disobey her husband, but a husband who wants to hover over and say, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, and over everything is defeating the purpose in many ways that God has given to his wife. He has to understand his wife has a God-given responsibility too, and he needs to lead in such a way that encourages her to do that rather than hindering her effort. Other comments on that or other aspects of managing the household? Steve?
And if the husband wants to, he can help the wife with some of those duties.
Okay, there may be some situations in which there's things about the household. In particular, there are times when things in the household, in the house, need to be taken care of, or the wife can't do her work. Today women have a lot of appliances and things like that that are very helpful, and that's nice. Well, the husband provides for his wife. He should try to help arrange, if he can, for her to have those things and to make sure they work. And a husband that it seems to me that a husband who doesn't cooperate with his efforts of his wife to be able to do her job is himself not understanding what her role is. I thought I saw some other hands. Terry.
Also, we see in Proverbs 31 that the wife was able to be involved in transactions of business. She knew the value of what she could make or what she could do and was able to sell that and make decisions about purchasing things for the good of the family. And it appears that her husband did not interfere with her in that. It was something she could do and was able to do. She had a mind. She wasn't just a servant in the household.
Okay, so again, some women, and again, all of us have degrees of ability. Some have more ability in some areas than others do. And that's going to be true for women as well as it is for men. But in particular, some women are so good at what they do in managing the household that they're able to provide things not just for their family, but for other people as well. Back to the point before about the widow that was enrolled was caring for those who are afflicted, the needy. And that's part of what a worthy woman should do. Or she can even, in some cases, provide so well for clothing and that kind of thing that she actually has some left over to sell, not just to give away to those in need, but to sell, and thereby help with the income of the family. So there's a lot that's involved in it. But again, it must be done subject to the husband. Please, I don't see anything here that says that she just gets to say, no, you can't tell me what to do because I'm the managing the household. I'm going to get to do what I want to do. You just let me do what I know. She's still subject to her husband, The point is the husband needs to realize that he's not to be so domineering that he actually hinders her from doing what she ought to be doing. Other comments on managing the household. All right, I want us to spend a little bit of time on, questions number, 24 and 25 especially. We've talked several times about the older women, the older widows, and what he said about them, the younger widows. I want to put it together. This was instructive to me. I hope it is to you. Look at what it says when you put together what he has said in these sections about the widow indeed, the enrolled widow, and the younger widow. Put it together, and here's what I see. She's to trust in God, back to the widow indeed, continue in prayer and supplication day and night, not to live in pleasure. She's to marry or be the wife of one man. She is to bear children, bring up children, manage the household, be hospitable both to strangers and to saints, he said, relieve the afflicted, diligently follow every good work. Now, when you put that together, you have a summary, it seems to me, of what God expects women to do. Again, this is assuming that she's able to marry. Again, sometimes that just doesn't work out. I don't believe this is intended to criticize a woman who, for whatever reason, is not able to marry. But this is the ideal. And look at what he said, what this says then when you put it together. We've talked a good bit about managing the household and so on. But what do you see as you look as an overview now of what he said about women in this chapter? What do you see here? How would you summarize it? Debbie.
It's almost the qualifications for an elder.
Okay. In a lot of ways, our discussion of qualifications for elders, here we have qualifications for a godly woman. Now, again, it's not the same, not a position like an elder. It's not a position in the church at all. But it shows what God is looking for and what we should look for, and in particular, what a godly woman should want for her life. Look at how she starts out. She's spiritual. She has a relationship with God. Trusts in God, continues in prayer. She has a relationship with God. She avoids immorality and sin. She has a family relationship, married, children, manage the household. She's concerned about other people, being hospitable, relieving the wicked. So you've got at least those three general categories. Now, that's not intended to list everything because he says diligently follow every good work. There are more specifics we could mention. But here is what, as far as I see, God wants women to be emphasizing. If they can possibly do this in their life, this is what they should be emphasizing. Comments? Discussion? Compare that. Oh, Frank, go ahead.
I was going to say, women of any age, whatever their circumstances, well, men also, we need to trust in God and serve God according to His will. And so we're all expected in God's sight to be His servants to the best of our ability in holiness.
Okay, and not only to be servants, but it would include also caring for needy people and so on. But notice the emphasis on marriage and bearing children and managing the household and so on. That seems to be especially emphasized because the woman was created to be a helper to the man. Karen.
Well, there's a great deal of fulfillment in doing those things because many of them you are directly affecting many other people's lives.
Okay, so in many ways it's a life of service to others, isn't it? Helping other people and benefiting them. Now contrast that to what we learned about, discussed not briefly, but not nevertheless about the man. The man, certainly he's to serve God and have a relationship with God, and he's to be concerned about needy people and so on. But on the other hand, he's a provider. He is the leader and the provider, and working to provide. And so we have, as we talked about, the man who's providing for his household, the man who's nurturing his wife, and being the head of the family and so on. So you have a distinction in roles. Why women have responsibilities, men have responsibilities. There is some overlap, certainly there is, but nevertheless there is distinctions. God created us different because we have different roles that he wants us to fulfill. And it's important, I believe, to understand that, because far too often we see problems in our society because the men and women don't recognize that God has created them for these roles. Anything else on the summary of the women and specifically the younger women? Anybody else? Come on.
I agree completely with what you just said. But also, if we went into studying the husband the way we have the woman, we would find that there are many scriptures for him and how he is to treat his family and his wife in love and care. So that takes care of the peace in the home.
Okay, and so obviously this passage is talking about widows.
Right.
So we're talking about this. We talked about the elders, and we laid pretty well into the men, I felt like. And then you get to Ephesians 5, and you have both the men and the women and so on. All right, what about verse 15? Some have turned aside after Satan. What does that have to do with our discussion? Some have turned aside after Satan. Debbie?
To me, it sounds like some of the younger widows did not take Paul's advice. And so they did not remarry, and they have.
Okay, and we're back to the idea then about the gossips and the busybodies and whatnot in verse 13. And the last part of verse 14 we didn't talk about either. He says, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. So what problems can occur then if a widow, or any woman for that matter, but a widow in particular, does not follow these instructions? What might happen? And I think we're on question number, well, I don't know. What can happen? What are some problems that can happen? What is he talking about giving no occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully? Karen.
Well, I know men and women both who've left their families for somebody else, and anybody who knew them, the church, neighbors, friends, they say, well, they were supposed to be a Christian and they did that, and they feel like, I may not even be religious, but I would never do that. I mean, if they speak reproachfully of the Christianity.
Okay. Other comments? Okay, so when this is not followed the way God says that it should be, this is a hindrance to the gospel. It's a hindrance to the church because people see that here's a woman who's supposed to, in this case, we're still talking about women, a woman who's supposed to be following God's plan, but she turns aside after Satan. She, as Karen said, she may desert her family, and you've probably known women like that. We certainly have. And what that does, not only to the family, which is tragic, to her husband and her children, but to the church and to the reputation that God's people have in the community. And it hinders the stand for truth when we don't fulfill our roles. Just like the man back in verse 8. If he doesn't provide for us, he's worse than an unbeliever. Okay? Did I see some other hands on this? Sharon.
I think we see here how important of a role a woman can have as a widow. We see through the Bible that when a woman was older and a widow and in need, it was easy for people to take advantage of her and for her to be in difficult circumstances, but the Bible intends for her to still have a very fulfilling and useful life, that she still has an influence for either good or bad, obviously, encouraging her to have an influence for good, that she still has plenty of opportunity to do all these good things and praying and helping others and so on. And that we shouldn't, whether it's because our spouse dies or other bad things happen to us, we shouldn't feel like we've lost the purpose in our life and we have nothing to give and nothing useful for anybody anymore. There's always good we can do as long as we're alive.
Thank you for that observation, Sharon. I'm confident, having obviously never personally been through it, but with my mother and so on, it's when she became a widow, it's so easy for a person to think almost that life is over when you lose a companion. What am I good for anymore? Your life has been so focused, which it should have been in your marriage. You should have focused on it, but now it's broken, and you no longer have that relationship. It's easy to think that there's nothing left. And obviously, this is very important to see that a younger widow can remarry, and the older widow, she has a lot of things she should still be doing and can be doing. And I think that's an important. Let's talk about women here. The same thing is true for men. It's easy, I think, for older people to think, okay, there's not much for me to do anymore. I'd like to do this, but I can't do it anymore. I don't have the health. I'd like to do that. Can't do that anymore either. And so if you're not careful, it's easy to give up and think you don't have a role anymore. You do. Find what you can do and do it in the Lord's service. Good point. All right. Now then, are we ready for verse 16? We move into verse 16, and here's the conclusion now. He's saying of this discussion. And what is it? What's the difference that as he reaches in verse 16 in his conclusion? And we're now in question number 26. What is the distinction that he's made as he concludes this discussion of this kind of widow and that kind of widow and so forth? What's the conclusion? Verse 16.
See, responsibility for the support rests first upon the family, and then when they're
Okay.
the church can.
All right. So there are widows for the church to take care of. There are widows for the family to take care of. See the difference? Those who have widows who have family, children, grandchildren, those people are supposed to take care of them. Let them relieve them. And do not let the church be burdened. But what should the church do?
Care for those that are widows indeed.
Okay, those that don't have family, to take care of them. Okay? So if a widow has family, the family's responsible. If he doesn't have family, the church may be responsible, again, depending on the situation and the need. But there's some restrictions, there's some limits, even on what the church can do. Not just the fact that she's a widow, but she was supposed to be a particular kind of person for the church to take care of. Okay, so, well, let me just do some summarizing here. Here's some things we've learned. First of all, the primary responsibility for caring for widows is on the family. Okay? The church has a responsibility, but it's limited to certain situations. Specifically, they don't have a family, but it's also limited in general, back to the widow and indeed and so on, was one who was a faithful Christian. Does the church have a responsibility to care for a widow who's not a Christian or not faithful? No. As far as I can see, the answer is no. Now, I know lots of people, and you probably do too, certainly lots of churches, religious denominations, who don't see that point. I don't see how you can come up with any other conclusion from this passage. So in particular, for example, if my elderly mother, she was a Christian, but suppose she hadn't been, did I still have a responsibility to take care of her, even if she wasn't a Christian? Sure I did. She's my mother. I should have taken care of her. But would the church have taken care of her if she didn't have family and wasn't a Christian? Would the church have a responsibility? As far as I can see, the answer is no. So the church's responsibility is limited, and there's other limits we could talk about too. But many people, even in churches of Christ, that are departing from God's way, have the idea that the church just takes care of everybody who comes along, and it's simply not biblical. There are some people that the church should not take care of, or should not have to take care of. Okay. On the other hand, then we need to learn then that means the responsibility of the church is different from that of us as individuals. And this is an important lesson, and this passage is very important in teaching that principle. And so question number 27. Suppose somebody tells you, and this argument was made lots of times years ago. I don't know if people are making it today anymore because I don't know if they care that much anymore, but it used to be. And I had an elder in an institutional church make this argument with me when I was in college. And basically the idea is, if the church is just individuals, right? So if the individuals can take care of a particular responsibility, then the church can take care of it. So whatever the individual can do, the church can do, was the argument. What do you learn about that from this verse? Now, there's lots of other passages we can talk about. What do you learn from this verse, verse 16? Is it true that the church can do whatever the individual can do? That's not what it says, is it? It's clearly distinguishing individual. You have this responsibility. Church has this responsibility. And if everybody does their job, then the jobs are different. I don't see how anybody can miss that point. Very important lesson then. Never let anybody reason, and don't you ever reason, well, the Christians can do it, therefore the church can do it. It's simply not so. Different instructions for different groups, different situations. Okay? Now I have a couple more questions I want to talk about on that, but questions or comments anybody have on that before we move on? All right. Does this mean that the church could never give anything to, say, a younger widow? Now, we've learned that the older widow who's to be enrolled is to be 60 years old and so forth and so on. Suppose a widow is 55. And I'm not trying to be snippy about this, but just to illustrate. She's 55 years old. She's a Christian. She's a member of the congregation. She's a good woman, has no family to take care of her. Does this mean that church can never give her anything? Because she's not 60 years old yet. Now, as soon as she turns 60, we'll take care of her. But no, not now. Is that what that's saying? And how do you know? Terry.
Back in Acts chapter 6, when the church was first beginning, there were widows that were Hebrews that were being neglected. There is no indication of their age or no indication that they had been taken in, but they needed help and they needed to be helped they were being helped by the church.
All right, let's enlarge on that. Daryl, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if that age restriction was in Acts chapter 6, but regardless of that, you go to later in the history of the early church, and Paul collecting funds to help needy people. Okay. There was no restriction on people in need who the church could help on some temporary as needed basis. And so a widow who's 55, she's a needy person, and the church has every right and need to help her.
Okay.
Just not in that permanent sense that the person 55 is widows and need.
Okay. Okay. Other comments? Steve.
In James 4:17 it says, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth not, to him that sin.
Okay, but we have to remember that doing good is always restricted by Scripture. You have to remember that. But if you take that and put it with what Daryl and Terry have been saying, the church has a responsibility to care for needy members in general. So that if you have a Christian who's in need, in general, and there are all kinds of examples of it in the Bible, if they're a Christian, they're in need, then we may have a responsibility, but it's always with the goal that they, as soon as possible, will be able to take care of themselves. It's a temporary thing. It's not that we're going to take care of you from now on. And that seems to me to be a part of the distinction here. The church has a responsibility to any needy member who's a faithful Christian and they're in need. That is another limitation, by the way, is that it's Christians, the church takes care of them in many scriptures. But nevertheless, what he's discussing here, it seems to me, then, is a more ongoing thing. That's why I made that point from the beginning. Okay? All right. So don't get the conclusion that, okay, she's a widow. Now, if it was a man, oh, yeah, he's in need. Yeah, we can take care of it. No, that's not the point. It's a distinction between an ongoing thing and a temporary situation. Terry.
Even in these verses earlier on, the idea that your family is responsible for you first before the church steps in to take care of a need. Your family is the first one that's responsible for you. Isn't that what he's saying in verse 5 or verse 8?
Well, not only verse 8, but verse 4, and I believe here in verse 16. But let's enlarge on that. Suppose she has a family. She's got a child or two or a grandchild or two. Does that always mean the church can't take care of her at all? The church can't do anything. Well, she's got a child, she's got a grandchild. The church can't do anything. What if the children can't do it? Not all children. The children may be in poverty. The point is, you have to take other scriptures, just like we do over and over. You have to take everything and put it together. And that's why I think it's important, some of the conclusions we're reaching, we have to remember that. Okay, other comments, discussion. Debbie.
Well, the church doesn't always have to be burdened with someone's need. If there's a member of the church that can relieve that person, as well as their family. So it comes back to individuals to do it first, perhaps, before it comes out of treasury.
Okay, it may not even be family. There may be some other situation. Okay, those are things to think about. But then I want to conclude with that God has a plan. God's wanting to take care of needs, and we help one another as Christians. But we have to understand the plan and follow the plan, and not just do things the way we want. There's a plan, God has a plan, but if we do it, then people are taken care of, and we help one another, provide for one another. Anything else on this discussion of widows, anything down through verse 16 now anyway? Terry.
I found it interesting that verse 16, at least in the New English, says if any believing woman has relatives. It's not just the responsibility of a man who has relatives. There can be women who have the capability of taking care of someone else in their family, apparently.
Well, I think it's more than that, Terry. Why do you suppose, let's enlarge on that. Why does it say if any believing man or woman has widows? Some of your older translations say man, but the newer ones all say man or woman. Why would it include a man or woman? Well, suppose, Karen.
Well, this could be a daughter, daughter-in-law, sister.
Well, okay. Suppose to illustrate, suppose it was Karen's mother. Shall I say, well, it's not my mother. We're not going to do anything for her. It's not my mother. Well, of course not. The point is, whether it's the mother of the wife or the mother of the husband. Either one. Their widowed mother is their responsibility. That's what I take out of it. Okay? That you have a responsibility to a widow regardless of which side of the family it's on. Did I see another hand?
Yeah, I think in Terry's translation, if I understood well, and in my translation, which is different than hers, different translation, but reads the same way, it's if any woman who is a believer. Not woman or man, but just woman.
Oh, okay. Now, thank you for bringing that up. The New King James says any believing man or woman. Okay. Well, Frank.
I noticed that the King James Version says if a man or woman has a widow.
Okay. So the King James and New King James say that way. And the English Standard and the New American Standard don't even mention the man. Well, okay. But the man is already here. I mean, we don't have to have him in verse 16. He was there back in verse 4, and he was there back in verse 8. So he's there, whether he's in verse 16 or not. Karen?
Well, I think Naomi and Ruth are a good example of this. Ruth took care of Naomi working in the fields. This was, her mother-in-law. She took care of her.
Oh, okay. And so in a case where there isn't any man at all, there's still a responsibility to do what can be done. Okay. All right. Other comments? Daryl.
Yeah, I don't think Terry's point was trying to get rid of the man's responsibility, but just that this verse, at least in these two translations, is really highlighting the woman, that she can have that responsibility to take care of her mother or whoever it might be.
Okay. All right. All right. But the man was highlighted earlier, the woman's highlighted later, so they're both involved. Other comments? All right. Well, it's time for us to take our break. It's a good break point. So next time, verse 17, we start with we're back briefly about elders, but we're still talking about honoring, the concept of honoring. And the questions there, please focus on this idea of verse 18 and what is the scriptures that are referred to there. Then we'll talk about what happens if an elder does something sinful and how do you deal with that. And making a public rebuke of sin and so forth. So we're moving into a different area, and yet some important lessons for us. Please be prepared for next time then. So thank you.